All right, so next up, we have Sue Saupe and Jesse Ross from SRCAC. Well, Jesse just finished his graduate degree at the University of New Hampshire in environmental engineering, and he did some of his thesis, well, he did his thesis work for SRCAC at Kachemak Bay Lab in Soldovia, and he's going to be talking about that research today, basically investigating how oil has the potential to mix with organic matter in the marine environment and get into the food web that way. And then also with Jesse is Sue Saupe, who many of you know works for SRCAC, and she is the science and research director there. And I've just started kind of getting to know Sue, and I didn't know that she grew up in Kodiak, and she's been doing marine-related science in Alaska since her undergrad chemistry days at UAF. And this is also not Sue's first rodeo with Science Night, so I'll let her take it away.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say I really love Science Night. I think it's a great venue, and you guys are always such a great audience, so I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here. Today I'm going to talk about oil-related marine snow, or ORMS, and implications for oil spill planning and response in the Gulf of Alaska. But it'll also be through the lens of a research study in Kachemak Bay that Jesse's going to talk about as part of his thesis project that's going to be looking at actual flux rates, concentrations of, composition of, and the potential formation of oil-related marine snow in Alaska. So this is going to be the organization of the talk, and I'll talk about oil-related marine snow, what it is, and its relevance to Alaska, and why Cook Inlet RCAC has become involved in this project and is supporting the research here. And Jesse will talk about measuring the sinking particles and the laboratory oil experiments and the interaction of oil with marine snow. I'm going to talk a little bit about what marine snow is, but if you start looking at the literature and you start reading up about it, you're going to find that there's so many different terms out there, and we even had to make a decision last night at dinner what we were going to call it. So I'm probably going to goof up and call it one of the others. But anyhow, there's natural marine snow, or just marine snow or natural marine snow, suspended particulate matter, which can include marine snow and other composition of minerals. There's oil mineral aggregates if you start throwing in oil into the system. There's marine oil snow, or MOS, and then there's marine oil snow sedimentation and flocculent accumulation, or MOSFA. And these are kind of really a thing. These are all like the thing, and this is like a phenomenon. This is the actual like sedimentation and flocculation and accumulation of it potentially on the marine seafloor. So when we talk about oil spill, you have an oil spill and you're worried about the fate of that spill, you know, there's considerations that we've, for decades, consider, which is we look at evaporation, oxidation, emulsification, spreading, stranding. Some of it goes into the water column. It's natural dispersion or chemically dispersed. You get dissolution in the water column. You can absorb onto particles. And within the water column, you can get biodegradation. And as this dispersion, you get things in the water column can be consumed and degraded in the water column, or a portion of it could be sedimented to the seafloor. And we know a lot about oil mineral aggregates related to oil spills worldwide, and also even in Alaska, and specifically in Cook Inlet. Dr. Jim Payne, who you're very familiar with from the work that he's done for Prince William Sound RCAC, in the 80s, he did really extensive research in Cook Inlet on oil mineral aggregates, both with and without dispersant. And then more recently, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, but I do have it at the end, who the partners are in this project. And so we do have that. But one of the partners funded at the Coastal Response Research Center, CRRC, and Dr. Nancy Kinner, who's the director of that, is present, but they funded some research looking at sediments at 4 different places in the United States, including Cook Inlet. So there were some more recent studies that were looking at in the interaction of oil and suspended sediments. And our reason for wanting to have good background information on that in Alaska is that we know that we have very high suspended sediment loads in many places in coastal Alaska. So we know that this aggregation of oil with minerals is an important factor in the ultimate fate of spilled oil in the environment. And one thing that some of the research has shown is that the makeup of these aggregates differs by the types of clay, whether you have kaolinite, chlorite, illite, or montmorillonite. And those differ throughout Alaska, so you can kind of expect differences in their buoyancy based on how they form these aggregates. But I'm going to talk about marine snow now, in addition to this one mechanism for potentially getting oil to the sea surface or the subsurface environment. And the marine aggregates with the sediments is typically a concern in the nearshore environment because that's where you're seeing that the sediments enter the water column. And what we're finding is that worldwide, of course, we've all known that marine snow is a mechanism to get organic carbon from the surface where you get primary productivity and you get the formation of organic carbon to the benthic environment and oftentimes into the deep, deep benthic environment. It is the source of carbon to the deep benthic food webs. And marine snow is associated with plankton, and then it incorporates the whole and decaying organisms, the byproducts of their feeding, mucus, exopolymers, their fecal pellets, all sort of combining. And as you get particulates as they are interacted with turbulence in the water column, they bump into each other and they can start aggregating into larger and larger aggregates. They can interact with sediments in the water column, and different, the amount of sediment that aggregates with it can affect buoyancy and increase the sinking rates. We also know because phytoplankton blooms and zooplankton feeding occur and differ spatially and temporally or seasonally, that you see differences in these natural marine snow events or the production of marine snow, excuse me, and the sedimentation of that. So that varies in space and time. And then there's considerations about the fate of marine snow. So a lot of it's moving this organic carbon from the surface down into the water column. So some of that is consumed in the water column, can be consumed, and then as something eats it, then it spits out some more fecal matter, and so it's kind of repackaged and kind of re-enters this whole marine snow phenomenon. It can accumulate on the seafloor, and it can be consumed by benthic organisms in the benthic environment. So that's natural marine snow, and that's this coupling or this connectivity between the surface and the subsurface environment, either the water column or the deep benthic environment. And the Deepwater horizon was the first oil spill where marine snow was considered a major or a potential factor for the accumulation of oil into the benthic environment. And oil droplets were observed in the organic matter. They were measured in the organic matter, and 3 to 14% of the Deepwater horizon oil is estimated to have been transported to the benthic environment by marine snow. And this is not including deposition in the benthic environment from the plume, the subsurface plume. This is from marine snow that's produced on the surface. And so that raises questions about potential routes of exposure to the food web. And can this happen in other places? If it happened in the Gulf of Mexico, what are conditions and where else can this happen? And it points out the need for baseline data where the drivers for the formation of oil-related marine snow are present. So this is a complicated slide, and I just want you to look at a couple things. They tried to include a lot of information in it, but I want to say that if you look at this as typically the near shore, near terrestrial, and this is offshore, You typically have your higher nutrients, clays or minerals in the water column, and high productivity and a lot more fresh water in it, and you have high nearshore productivity, and it's in this shallower environment that you typically have this connection between surface and the benthic environment. Offshore, you typically have lower nutrients, lower mineral content, and lower productivity, and of course deeper waters, and so less connectivity between the surface and the marine environment. But there's a couple things I want to point out here, is that you can have this deposition, and you can have deposition if you had a pretty heavy marine snow incident. You could potentially accumulate it in an area of very low currents in one spot and change that environment and create an anoxic environment, and accumulate high organic matter and change the microbial populations and what's happening on in the benthos. But you can also have this transport from the shallower environment, if you have areas of strong currents, to areas offshore or into crevices or canyons, and that's what they did see in the Deepwater horizon, was a transport off the shelf. So the relevance of this, the lessons learned and what we've been learning from the Deepwater horizon, how is that relevant to Alaska and the concerns of Cook Inlet RCAC and other people that are interested in oil fate and effects in Alaska? Well, I mentioned, the drivers for the formation of ORMS, or oil-related marine snow, and there's three kind of key drivers that have been identified from the work of the Deepwater horizon and some of the laboratory works, and that's, well, if it's oil-related, so oil in the environment, high primary productivity at the surface, and suspended sediments in the water are going to help increase that sedimentation rate. We also know that there are potential impacts from having marine snow events, and what are at risk? Well, there's a risk of accumulating benthic oil into the seafloor, and then subsequently entering into the food web, and then potentially changing benthic conditions, either through sort of smothering with high organic content and use of oxygen, so creating some anoxic conditions, and therefore changing community assemblages. So those are the risks. And when we talk about oil, being a driver, we know that we have significant risk, and I'm focusing on the areas of interest to Cook Inlet RCAC, but we know in many places of Alaska we have risks of oil spill from various factors, and here we have a lot of production activity associated with these blocks, either in state waters and federal waters. Even though currently this is the only active area of the Cook Inlet planning area, it could potentially include the whole area, and the most recent administration had discussed opening up all OCS planning areas to potential lease sales in the near future. And we also know that we have a lot of transportation in the blues, the tanker routes in and out of Cook Inlet, so we have these oil spill risks from production, exploration, development, state and federal, and transportation risks. So I also want to talk about areas that are at risk from these activities that could be occurring either in Cook Inlet from production up here, or from future development here or elsewhere, or transportation through these areas. But I talked about these areas of high productivity, and potentially, especially if you add some mineral composition through clays, and we have pretty high concentrations of clays, even fairly offshore in the environment in coastal Alaska. But if you look at this really beautiful bathymetric map that's available from NOAA, you can see these big, wide shelf banks that occur west of Kodiak and in other areas along the western Gulf of Alaska. And how am I doing on time? 7 minutes? Okay, I'm close. And so I wanted to point out these two areas here, Portlock banks, that are in the vicinity of these operations. If you look, this is work that was published in 2005, but this is chlorophyll, actual measurements of chlorophyll above Portlock Banks. You can see this really high productivity that occurs there. And potentially in certain environments or conditions, this could deposit down to these shallow areas and be transported elsewhere. And more recently, with the new LTER, the Long-Term Environmental Research transect that they've run out and across Albatross Bank, they're collecting data. And this is fluorescence, which is a measure of chlorophyll concentration in the water column. But what I want to point out is that there's a really strong coupling between the surface and the benthic environment. So you know that what's happening at the surface can potentially impact here. So if you have chlorophyll that's going from the surface to the benthic environment, you would also have oil if you had interaction of that oil with the phytoplankton that occurred there. And why that's of concern to us was it kind of was brought to the forefront when the proposed pre-authorization zones for Alaska came out. About 3 years ago, we got very concerned because they overlapped really strongly with these big offshore banks, shallow, highly productive areas, and really important as nursery grounds for a lot of different species. And so we put some significant comments in on our concerns about that and the potential for interaction of oil through marine snow to enter these shallow, highly productive marine waters and enter the benthic food web. And through our comments and Prince William Sound RCAC comments and comments of others, they did remove from automatic pre-authorization, so now they'll be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But it doesn't remove our concerns for these areas because there could still be oil that would be put into the water column there. And so we still have interest in doing work there. So you're going to hear about Jesse's research that took place in Kachemak Bay, but we were also able to get him to deploy his equipment out for a little tiny pilot project out here that we are hoping to expand into the future and look at marine snow, the composition and the flux rates in these areas. So we'll be working with partners into developing a proposal. And one of the teams that's interested in participating with us is Nancy, pardon? Wadden. Thank you. But it's in the Netherlands, yes. So I've just been on the teleconference with them. I have not met them in person. So, but they've done some benthic mesocosm experiments, and they're very interested in doing some that are representative of food web type of organisms that we see in the Western Gulf of Alaska. And so we hope that ultimately some of our research would lead to some mesocosm experiments where we can look at the potential transfer up through the water column. And so now I just want to, Jesse's going to talk about a very specific research project that took place measuring flux as part of his thesis project that we've been supporting. And I want to say that in our plans for the future to do this additional research, hopefully east of Kodiak, with implications for improving our ability to evaluate environmental trade-offs during an oil spill. And ultimately, we hope that the kind of information that we're going to collect can inform transport and fate models in Alaska and make for better decision making. And two of the partners that are going to go in and hopefully develop this future research are here in the room, and that's Drs. Nancy Kinner, the director of CRRC, and Dr. Lisa DePinto with NOAA's Office of Restoration and Response, and they're sitting in the back. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Jesse.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sue. Thanks for setting up all the marine snow things. I get to talk about what I actually got to do on a boat. It's great to be here. I've only seen Dan in rain gear before, so it's fun. It's fun to be here in December after 2 summers at Kachemak Bay Lab. So yeah, that's what it looked like. Oh, this is the wrong. Nice days in Kachemak Bay. I'll be talking about collecting sinking particles and then the laboratory component with oil mixing with plankton. So back to this picture, just to draw your attention, we're focused in on what's happening subsurface. A lot of oil spill response is focused on oil spreading, but then we're thinking about marine snow as a mechanism after that oil is dispersed in the water column. So the project goal is to enhance understanding for responders of oil fate and transport. And we're addressing two questions here. We're trying to characterize what's naturally sinking without contamination. And then the second part is, what does that look like with oil mixed in? So we're asking questions like how much is sinking, what is it made up of? And then in the laboratory, looking at how oil changes the formation of marine snow. Kachemak Bay was chosen as the site for this because of the Kachemak Bay lab, but also as a representative ecosystem where there's a strong gradient throughout our sites. Pictured here, again, the Gulf Watch shout out, but these are the long-term oceanographic sites that are currently visited, I think, monthly or quarterly. So we tied into those sites, and we're able to explore the gradient within Kachemak Bay of less sediment to more sediment within the bay. And then Anchor Point out here is also of interest because of the high benthic production. And this whole area really is of interest because of the halibut and the commercial fisheries. There's a lot of biomass in that area. So having oil reach that is definitely of concern. So what we were doing at each of these sites was deploying this sediment trap. So this array of tubes is here. That's way down on this trap, but this whole rig is set up with floats. And then these tubes sit there passively like you were holding a cup out in the rain, just collecting rain. So as the particles sink through the upper water column, the trap was sitting at a depth of 20 meters below a less dense mixed layer from that Gulf Watch data. We knew where the mixed layer was, and we were able to put the trap below that, assuming that the particles were settling to the seafloor. So here's a video. You're actually looking at a GoPro mounted on the trap of marine snow. So that was the first box to check with this project is, yes, there's marine snow in Kachemak Bay, and there's a lot of it. And there's a lot of other things going on too. So this was a jellyfish that got lowered the trap onto. This is, you can see, I get excited about all the white particles moving around here, but that stung my hand when I touched the tube after. And then an exciting video was this octopus that hitched a ride for about an hour. I mean, there are 4 tubes on this, and it landed on the one in front of the camera, which is awesome. It is a good reminder for scientists to always have replicates, because it just sat there for the next 45 minutes, and it's my favorite video from the summer. But really, there's life going on down there, and it's yeah, it's messing with the data. So I guess I'll have to sample again out there. So what was in the tube really ranged from along the bay. In Kachemak Bay was really organic, and you can see that it's greener opposed to Anchor Point with high mineral content because it was closer to the Anchor River outflow, and it was significantly different. And then that also showed up when we quantified that. So taking the particle flux measurement so that we could compare site to site, we took 3 of the tubes and then filtered them, and then that filter's weighed so that we know how much contents are. We're able to compare the total quantity from site to site. So here's all the data from 2 summers split from 2018 and 2019. The vertical axis shows the quantity, and the sites are along the x-axis here. But the total flux is in blue, and the organic flux, so the portion that we're really focused on mixing with oil, is in red. And some takeaways here are that fluxes were significantly lower this past summer. At the 2 sites, middle and outside, were visited both summers, and it was a significant difference. You can see the red bars are all the same, so that indicates that the primary production was similar throughout all sites and both seasons. And thinking back about last summer, anyone that was in this area or in Homer, it didn't rain for 5 weeks straight. So looking at the Copper River outflows and trying to piece together why the organics would be consistent and there would be less minerals there, it's probably related to the runoff. So that's painting this picture of what drives flux in this area. That's a step towards understanding that. And then anchor point, this is the real difference here, is that anchor point had an incredibly high flux, and that's just a totally different scenario out there physically and biologically, but it shows how different it can be just a few miles away around the corner. And to put this in the context of Deepwater Horizon, for those that are aware, these fluxes are 10 times higher than what was measured in that region where the Deepwater Horizon spill was. So now a few slides on what we were doing in the lab to look at how oil mixes with this. At one of the sites, I was taking a 1 liter sample of surface water and then adding North Slope crude oil, the plankton assemblages, the natural surface waters had all the plankton in it, the ingredients for marine snow, and then adding sediment to some replicates. And this is what it looked like. They rolled for 5 days, and then we were studying what's the mechanism of how oil gets entrained in these aggregates, and then what happens afterwards. And so you can see that the 4 treatments, this is seawater plus oil plus sediment, and then all 3 together. They look different, but I was able to spend a lot of the rainy days with after that first May of the summer, looking under the microscope at what they actually look like in pipetting out smaller aggregates. So this is just without any oil. There are diatoms loosely aggregating where it really clumped together was within the presence of oil, and then the same thing was felt here with the sediment. And an awesome tool that we had was a UV fluorescent microscope. So here's the proof that it's actually oil. So if you pick out a droplet here, that shows up and fluoresces under fluorescent light, and when there's no oil, it's not there. So this is really qualitative, but it shows that oil is mixing in there. And so a next step was trying to quantify how much oil was in the marine snow aggregate, and you can see that, like this droplet here, that's a larger droplet, but we used a computer an analysis tool that took the diameter of each of those droplets for many samples, and then assumed they were spherical, and we could come up with this range of 0.6 to about 10% of the oil that was added to the sample or added to that water ended up in these matrices of organic matter. And so what our takeaways are from this is that oil increased aggregation. There was more matter because of the presence of oil. The sediment, without sediment, the flocks weren't sinking. And that was also an interesting finding. So during a spill, it might not all lead to deposition right away because of the buoyancy of oil. And then this range is in the same order of magnitude as what other studies are finding in other places. So the answer is yes, this indicates this scenario could happen in this region, in the subarctic at large. But there are some bigger questions of how does this scale? It's obviously not applicable to necessarily a 200,000 gallon tanker spill, but it's something that we'd recommend that responders look for during a spill. And also the idea of how does this look in January versus during a spring bloom in May. And here for the last slide of implications of what does this actually mean? It means there's a high particle flux that could transport oil. There's a high amount of that is organic, which means that fish will be likely to eat it, and that's a new pathway or a newly considered pathway for oil to get into the food web. And then what this means for responders is understanding that understanding this process and how it fits into a response will allow them to accurately assess the damage, minimize the damage, and then apply their efforts to where they can be most optimized. And this is really the driver, the why behind the project is there's a lot of fish that are feeding on marine snow. If there's oil in there, that's the route that needs to be considered. So thank you to a whole team of people, the folks at Kachemak Bay Lab, a lot of time spent on teleconferences trying to get input from folks up here. And then thank you all for hanging in there to the last the last talk tonight. So I appreciate it.
Have you guys taken the results of this information and all of the studies you've done and done bottom samples anywhere where the Exxon Valdez oil would have presumably settled, and came up with any kind of information on the long-term effects?
That's a great question. No, I personally haven't, and we haven't, but a lot of the alarming part of the Deepwater horizon is they went back to previous spills and were able to see that signature in the sediment, and see the depleted oxygen conditions even 30 or 40 years later. So I think that's a great point. Sue?
But the important point to remember is that the Exxon Valdez happened, it was a very cold year, and it happened in March, and you didn't have these big high productivity and spring blooms. So when they actually did the estimates from the sampling that they did do, and they do budgets, oil fate budgets, the benthic environment was not, the deep benthic environment was not impacted. So it's a shallow that was probably associated with, more associated with the coastal sediments than, but it doesn't mean that in a different season, you wouldn't have a different story. Would you rather me go? Sure. Yeah.
I believe both RCACs have put forward objections to dispersants, use of dispersants. Could your work be applied to quantify these objections, to more be more specific about the impacts that dispersants might bring to the benthic environment?
That's definitely a reason why people are curious in this process. We left that out of the scope of this project, but it's definitely in mind. The more oil that gets dispersed into the water column, the more it's going to interact with this vector, and that's the question, is whether it will biodegrade or reach the bottom potentially before biodegrading, if it's mixing with marine snow. So I'm not going to go there with defending the decision, but that's up to Sue, I think, to answer.
Yeah, I think we wanted to start with simple, and that could, eventually lead to some more complex studies. But one of the things that was interesting during the Deepwater horizon is that there were long-term applications of dispersants, and they felt that, or some of the data is showing that the dispersants actually increase the production of marine snow, not just the aggregation of the oil with marine snow, but actual production of marine snow, natural marine snow.
In the situation you mentioned there, where you've got the original organic element and you've got oil, but you don't have particulates, mineral particulates, and you're not getting sinking, what is the long-term fate of those non-mineral contaminated agglomerations? Do they wander off into the sunset, or break up, or finally find some minerals? What's the story with them?
The quick answer is I don't know where they end up, but if you're talking about this aggregate that's with oil in it and it's neutrally buoyant, or it's being advected and carried around, just like in those videos you're seeing marine snow flying, it's not all perfectly settling as predicted by Stokes' law, or how it's moving around in the currents. And that's a big question, is then to look at points of where this would potentially be eventually deposited, or would it hit a curtain of higher sediment in Deepwater horizon, where these marine snow aggregates were hitting the outflow of the Mississippi River, that was adding the ballast weight that was sinking the aggregate. So that's definitely a question of how do it would be considered in modeling this.
And the longer that they are in the water column, the more likely they are to continue to aggregate and become larger and then sink. but also the longer they are in the water column, the more likely they are to be consumed in the water column as well. So
In any of the studies that were done across the country, did anyone analyze the percentage of plastics that are collected in these snows?
I think that's a emerging hot topic. I've seen a request out for that kind of research, but I haven't seen any data on that.
Just another question here, but I'm not scientific by any means. I'm a commercial fisherman. So what am I seeing? I mean, I just not catching the fish on the bottom, sores, lesions, reproductive. What's the effect of this?
I think that's the question for the toxicologist, and that when through that mesocosm experiment of seeing how it transfers through the food web, we'll start to answer those questions. But this research is really focused on would oil get there during a spill, and that responders should know that if it does get there. But I think that the acute effects are out of my scope of understanding, but definitely of concern.
Yeah, the question on the volume estimates, if you had looked at the difference between your application with and without sediment.
So the question is what were the volumes for the mineral?
Yeah, you're the 0.6 and 9.3. I was wondering if you had the same estimate for with sediment and without.
Right. So because the sediment didn't end up in these droplets, that oil is really mixed in to an oil mineral aggregate. We weren't able to estimate volume in the same way. So there's literature and other studies on the oil that gets incorporated in that, but I didn't make the comparison here.
Yeah, I got a question. I was curious about sorry, your so these aggregation rates you're seeing inside of your little mesocosms. I'm curious how that might compare out in the ocean, the open ocean. It seems like when you constrain it to a confined space, then there's more chances of them all interacting together. And so I'm just curious how that translates out.
Right. That's scaling what's happening in a 1 liter bottle to the ocean is definitely something we've talked a lot about, and that's we're hesitant to do because you're right. It's in there for 5 days under constant light and less energy than what might happen out in lower Cook Inlet. But we worked really hard with a lot of stakeholders and industry and government scientists to try to make this as realistic as possible, but understanding that in the environment that it probably isn't going to scale.
Yeah, I'm just curious if it would make more neutrally buoyant or more positively buoyant aggregates.
It would, I think, with high energy and breaking waves, then there's more oil being dispersed naturally dispersed into the water column, but also the likelihood that these aggregates would break up is probably higher too. So there's a whole group working on these exact questions, but that's a great point.
Well, with that, I just want to say thank you very much to Jesse and Sue for the great presentation. And that's all we have for tonight. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you all learned something tonight. So good night.